For years, his father warned him never to touch the massive stone in the west field. After a violent storm, his dog began barking at it nonstop. When he looked closer, he saw a thin crack and felt cold air breathing out from below. What was buried there wasn't natural. It had been hidden on purpose for decades. The ground shifted, and the past clawed its way back. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to my channel and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your support truly means the world to us. Late summer fog clung low across the Colorado foothills, softening the scars the storm had left behind. The wind had stilled, but the land still held its breath. Liam Carter stood alone near the fence line behind the old barn, tightening the last wire. His hands were scraped raw from a morning of repairs, but he didn't mind the ache. It was honest work, the kind that left you tired but calm. At 44, Liam wore time across his face like stone worn by weather. Defined jaw, gray-streaked dark hair, a permanent furrow between his brows. His skin was tan, leathery from years of sun and war zones. As a former Marine, his body was still strong, but slower now, heavier with a quiet grief he never voiced aloud. He had returned to the family farm a year ago after his discharge. Not because he loved the place. He didn't. It was isolation he wanted. Noise, crowds, and the constant hum of threat had carved deep grooves into his nerves. The farm, with its wide skies and slow days, gave him space to breathe again, to remember what still mattered. But even here, ghosts lingered, especially in the form of a warning his father had repeated all through his boyhood like a ritual. Don't go near the boulder in the west field, ever. The boulder? It was massive, irregular, gray with veins of rust-red stone. It sat like a dormant giant half buried in the western slope of the property at the edge of the last usable field. His father, William Carter, had never explained the rule. Not when Liam was 7 and tried to climb it. Not when he was 16 and asked about its origin. William would shut down, jaw clenched, voice low. It holds the land together. Leave it be. And that was the end of it. William Carter had been a hard man, tall, square-shouldered, with a permanent squint and a silence that could fill a room. Farming was his faith and discipline his scripture. He had died 5 years ago from a stroke, alone in this very field. Liam didn't cry at the funeral. Marines were trained for loss, for silence. But sometimes, in the deep hours of the night, when the wind slipped between the walls of the old house, Liam could almost hear his father's boots on the porch. And that damn warning rang in his memory, louder with each passing year. Still, he never once walked back to that stone since coming home. Until today. It was Coda who led him there. Coda was 5 years old, a large black and white German shepherd with bright amber eyes and a thick coat that shimmered in the sun. Liam had rescued him during a final mission overseas, a collapsed outpost, the dog trapped, refusing to abandon the injured handler. That kind of loyalty doesn't go unnoticed. Since then, they had been inseparable. That morning, as Liam finished fixing the last line of fencing, Coda suddenly stiffened, ears forward, body coiled. Then he barked once and bolted west, across the muddy yard and over the ridge. Liam cursed, dropped his gloves, and ran after him. His boots sank into the sodden earth, still soaked from last night's storm. When he crested the hill, his breath caught. Coda stood motionless, facing the boulder. His hackles were raised, a low rumble in his throat. At first, Liam saw nothing unusual, but when he moved closer, he saw it, a narrow, clean vertical crack slicing down the face of the rock. Thin, sharp, like a wound freshly split open. Something about it made the air feel wrong. Liam stepped closer, squatted, and placed his hand along the crack's edge. It was cooler than the surrounding air. And then, barely perceptible, he felt it. A faint current, dry and unnatural, whispering outward. not like damp earth or decay. It felt older, sterile, foreign. A sudden shiver ran through him, not from the cold, but from memory. His father's voice, firm, final, rose in his head again. "Don't go near the boulder." He pulled his hand back, heart thudding. Coda moved to stand beside him, gaze fixed on the crack. He whined softly, then looked up at Liam, ears flat, tail rigid. The storm last night had been brutal. Branches ripped down, topsoil stripped, part of the northern fence gone. It had also done something else. It had cracked open whatever had been sealed beneath this rock, and Liam, despite every warning, was now standing at the threshold. He didn't want to believe there was anything more than old stone and superstition here, but something beneath his feet had shifted, and Coda had sensed it before he did. He stood there longer than he meant to, his breath fogging in the cooling air. In the distance, the clouds were thinning, revealing pale sun through the haze. The crack wasn't large, but it was unnaturally straight. No jagged breaks, no signs of erosion, as if something inside had pushed outward, not weathered inward. Liam glanced down again at Coda, who had now laid down in the mud beside the stone, still staring at the crack as if expecting it to move. And for the first time in years, Liam Carter, combat veteran, son of a stern father, keeper of a haunted past, felt something unfamiliar stirring inside his chest. Not fear, not yet, but something like it. And this time, it wasn't coming from the war behind him. It was coming from the land beneath him. Liam Carter didn't sleep that night. He lay on his back in the same room he had grown up in, staring at the familiar knot patterns in the pinewood ceiling, listening to every groan of the old farmhouse as if the walls themselves were unsettled. The crack in the boulder kept resurfacing in his mind, its clean lines, the cold breath it exhaled, and the eerie stillness of the air around it. But more than the crack, it was Coda's reaction that stayed with him. The dog hadn't barked in alarm. He had growled low, as if warning something inside not to come out. By morning, Liam had convinced himself it was just a damaged rock exposed by the storm. Maybe it had always had a fissure, and he'd never noticed. Still, when he went outside, he instinctively checked the boulder again. The crack remained, and though it hadn't widened, the soil around the base looked darker, as if moisture had been drawn up from below. Coda sniffed it again, circled the stone once, then sat facing it like a soldier on watch. Liam muttered, "Yeah, I feel it too," and returned to the barn for tools, not to dig, but to secure the area. Around mid-morning, an old pickup truck rumbled down the gravel drive. Liam recognized the sound before he saw the truck. It was Martha Ellis, his closest neighbor, though close in these parts still meant a mile and a half away. She was in her early 70s, wiry and upright, with white hair always tied back in a tight bun, a permanent frown carved deep into her forehead, and a sharpness to her tone that often belied a gentler heart. She'd lived in the valley her entire life, a widow for over 20 years, and often checked in on Liam like a mother bird pretending not to care. She stepped out in heavy boots, jeans, and a faded green flannel shirt that might have been older than Liam himself. "Your power flickered during the storm?" she asked, skipping greetings. "No," Liam replied, "but the fence took a hit. And something else." Martha followed his eyes toward the western ridge. Her expression shifted, just barely, but it was enough. "The boulder?" she asked. Liam nodded. "Cracked during the storm. Coda found it. There's air coming out of it." He expected her to laugh or dismiss it as nerves. Instead, she went quiet. Her mouth pressed into a thin line. "You know my father always told me not to go near it," Liam said. "Did yours say the same?" She didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, "My husband, Walter, worked the same soil. He called it a cover, not a rock." Then she added, as if to herself, "Something about the ground not wanting to be touched there." Liam's stomach tightened. "What do you mean, cover?" Martha shook her head, clearly weighing how much to say. "Ask yourself this, Liam. Why would 4 generations of farmers leave the most fertile section of the valley untouched?" He looked toward the field. That slope had never been farmed, never tilled, despite being gently graded and sunlit. Even now, grass grew thinner there, and the soil felt heavier underfoot. "I thought it was superstition," he said. "My dad didn't believe in curses, but he believed in keeping his mouth shut." Martha looked at Coda, who had returned to sit beside the boulder. "Sometimes animals know before we do," she said quietly. "You should trust that dog. He's seeing something we can't." As she drove away, Liam remained by the stone. He ran his fingers along the crack once more. The current of air was still there, steady, unnatural. He didn't feel fear exactly, but he felt watched. The kind of quiet observation that didn't come from above or behind, but from beneath. He would not dig yet, but he would not walk away again. The third morning after the storm dawned cold and still, with a haze clinging low over the fields like breath held too long. Liam Carter stood once again at the edge of the boulder, a shovel in his hand, and the past pressing in on his chest like a weight. He had spent the night replaying Martha's words, the tone she hadn't quite hidden, the way her eyes darted toward the field without meeting his. She had known more than she'd said, of that he was sure, but what haunted him more was the certainty in Coda's stare. The dog hadn't left the stone since yesterday, lying close to the crack as if guarding something sacred, or dangerous, or both. Coda watched him now, ears flicking slightly, tail flat along the ground. Liam crouched beside him and ran a hand over the dog's thick fur, black streaked with white around the chest and shoulders. Coda was tense, alert, but didn't resist when Liam began to dig. The soil was looser than he expected, moist, dark, and unwilling to cling, almost as if it had been disturbed not so long ago. After just 20 minutes, the metal edge of his shovel struck something hard, not rock, not root. He scraped the dirt away with gloved hands and uncovered a flat surface, concrete, pale and weathered, but clearly manufactured. Liam's breath caught in his throat. Concrete didn't belong here, not beneath an untouched field, not beneath an ancient boulder. He ran his fingers along the edge of the surface, brushing away more dirt, revealing a faint seam, a line. And then, about 2 feet to the left, he found it, the top step of a staircase, narrow and half-choked with soil, descending into darkness. He sat back on his heels, heart pounding. A staircase meant a structure meant intent. Someone had built this, and someone had buried it again. He fetched a coil of rope, a flashlight, and strapped on his old combat knife, not out of paranoia, but out of habit. Before descending, he looped the rope around a thick root embedded near the boulder's base and tugged it twice to test the hold. Coda let out a low whine but stayed behind, as trained, lying near the edge like a sentinel. The air shifted as Liam descended, the flashlight beam slicing into dust and damp. The steps creaked faintly beneath his boots, but held firm. The walls were close, barely wider than his shoulders, built of poured concrete, now flaked with mold and time. As he reached the bottom, the narrow passage leveled out into a corridor no more than 5 feet wide, its floor cracked but solid, its ceiling supported by metal beams now rusted and sagging. His light passed over the first sign of man-made content. A rusted barrel collapsed inward, orange streak staining the ground beneath it. Nearby lay a length of coiled cabling, brittle and snapped at the ends. Against the wall, partially buried in debris, was a large box-shaped machine, unidentifiable under the layers of corrosion and decay. And then he saw it. On the far wall, faint but deliberate, a series of numbers stenciled in faded black. Liam stepped closer, breath hitching as the digits came into view. It was a date, the same year his father bought the property. It hit him harder than he expected. Not just surprise, but something more visceral. Betrayal, maybe. All his life, his father had deflected questions about that stone, shut them down with sternness and silence. But now Liam knew. The man hadn't just known about the boulder. He had known about what lay beneath it, and he had chosen never to tell. The days following Liam's descent beneath the boulder unfolded with a quiet unease that settled into the farm like a slow fever. Nothing dramatic announced itself at first. It began with the well water, which carried a faint metallic bitterness that lingered on the tongue longer than it should have. Liam noticed it while standing at the kitchen sink one morning, shirt sleeves rolled, jaw tight, staring at the glass as if it had betrayed him. He boiled the water, changed filters, told himself storms stirred sediment. But then the grass around the boulder yellowed, not in a ring but in irregular patches, as if the soil were bruising from the inside out. Coda avoided the area now. When he did approach, he coughed lightly, a dry irritation that made Liam's chest tighten with a protective reflex he'd learned overseas: assess, contain, don't ignore. Liam began marking dates, tastes, colors. The Marine in him took notes because denial had once cost lives. At night he returned to the edge of the west field and listened. The land no longer felt neutral. It felt reactive, as if responding to something newly unsealed. He didn't dig again. He didn't call anyone. He waited, knowing that waiting had a way of summoning the truth faster than panic ever could. The truth arrived in the form of a black SUV that rolled up the gravel drive late morning, clean enough to look misplaced against mud and dust. Two men stepped out. The first introduced himself as Daniel Price, mid-40s, tall and narrow, with neatly trimmed salt and pepper stubble and eyes that measured distances the way engineers do. His suit was casual expensive, the kind chosen to signal approachability without surrendering authority. The second, Evan Brooks, was younger, broader, shaved head, catching the sun. His smile came quickly and left just as fast, a practiced reflex. They asked about storm damage in calm voices, nodded at the fence, the barn, the well. Liam answered carefully, posture relaxed, hands visible. When Price mentioned the west field, his tone didn't change, but his gaze did. Briefly, precisely. "We've had reports of soil instability in pockets like this," he said, as if reading from memory. Brooks added lightly, "Usually tied to old formations. Boulders can shift." The word landed with intent. Liam felt it. Coda did too, rising to stand at Liam's side, shoulders squared, amber eyes locked on Brooks's knees. Price noticed and smiled. "Good dog," he said, without warmth. They didn't ask to see the stone. They didn't need to. As they left, Price offered a card and a line that sounded like concern and felt like instruction. "If anything changes, let us handle it. Saves everyone trouble." The SUV disappeared down the drive. Liam stood where he was, the card unbent in his hand, understanding at last that the secret under his land had watchers, and that waiting was no longer a neutral act. The next morning was cold and brittle, the air sharp like old glass. Liam stood before the door of his father's office, a room sealed by memory more than locks. The oak door creaked as he pushed it open, and the scent of old paper and machine oil greeted him, untouched by the years. The room was simple but dense, a heavy desk, rusted filing cabinets, framed metals, and an oil painting of a Colorado ridge that always seemed darker than it should. Liam had rarely been allowed inside as a boy. Now, returning as a man, he moved through the space like stepping through fog laced with ghosts. He moved to the desk first. Dust coated everything, but the metal lockbox in the bottom drawer was clean, recently handled. Inside, he found a small stack of documents bound by twine and sealed in brittle wax. The first was a deed transfer dated back 3 decades. The farm had been purchased at 1/3 of its value, signed off by a corporate entity with no clear origin. Liam frowned. The next page was worse. a legal clause requiring the landowner to maintain the integrity of all natural formations within Plot B. Vague, but ominous. A folded letter sat underneath, never mailed, addressed simply, "To my son, if I'm gone." Liam hesitated. The envelope felt heavy, like it carried more than paper. He opened it slowly. His father's handwriting, once so steady, now trembled across the page. The words weren't poetic. They were urgent, clipped, almost military. His father had seen something beneath that stone, something he was legally bound not to disturb, but morally unable to ignore. The last line struck Liam like a rifle crack. "If the stone fractures, don't seal it. Don't run. Prepare." That was it. No details, no explanations, just the sense that whatever had been buried wasn't just geological. Liam let the letter fall onto the desk. Coda, who had followed him silently, rested his head on Liam's boot, sensing the shift. For the first time in his life, Liam didn't feel like the man of the house. He felt like a messenger, carrying forward a warning that had never been delivered. He looked around the office, now realizing it wasn't just a workspace. It was a bunker of truths unsaid. Every dusty file, every unopened drawer, held pieces of a reality his father had chosen to live beside, but never speak of. And Liam, the son who had once thought his father quiet out of stubbornness, now saw the silence for what it really was. Protection. The wind had shifted by the time Liam descended again into the cold mouth of the underground corridor. It carried with it the scent of distant pine smoke and distant tension, the kind that settles in a soldier's bones before anything happens. He wore a canvas field jacket, the same kind he'd kept since his deployment in Marja, and strapped to his belt was a compact camcorder already blinking red. Every inch of the corridor was filmed this time, from the corroded barrels leaking oxidized sludge to the concrete walls etched with numbers, some matching the old military cipher charts he had once memorized. This wasn't superstition. It was a cover-up. Coda moved ahead, deliberate but alert. The German shepherd's black and white fur was flecked with dirt and rust, his ears twitching at the softest clink of dripping metal. Nearly 7 years old, Coda was no longer a pup, but his senses remained razor-sharp. He stopped by a wall panel, sniffed, and scratched once. Behind the crumbling plaster, Liam found an inlet pipe stained with orange crust, leaking into the groundwater, possibly for decades. He carefully filled 2 glass vials with soil, and another with the thin, metallic-tinted water seeping through the crack, sealing each and labeling them for the lab. He knew someone would try to say this was natural. That's why he needed evidence. He contacted a non-governmental environmental watchdog based out of Boulder. Clean reputation, no corporate ties. He sent encrypted copies of the footage, geotags, and samples. A man named Reed Talbot, their lead investigator, confirmed receipt within hours. Reed, 50s, ex-Forest Service, had the kind of gravel voice you only get from decades of yelling over chainsaws and rivers. He promised discretion, but also hinted that if the leak matched certain chemical signatures from Cold War-era waste, others might already be watching. And they were. That evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge, the black SUV returned. This time, it didn't park at the gate. It rolled directly up the gravel drive. 2 men stepped out, not the same ones as before. One was clean-shaven with a sharp suit and dead gray eyes, the other taller, broader, with a buzz cut and military boots polished to a shine. No name tags, no greetings, just a calm but pointed warning. Some things are buried for a reason. This isn't about you. Don't make it about you. Liam didn't flinch. He stood firm, one hand resting on Coda's neck. The dog didn't growl, just stared, unblinking. Liam had spent years in foreign deserts where threats wore uniforms. These men wore suits, but the language was the same, and he'd had enough of silence. "I'm not trying to start something," he said quietly, "but I won't be the one who keeps it hidden anymore." As the SUV rolled back down the hill, the ridge wind picked up again. Liam looked down at Coda. "We started this. We finish it." Sunlight spilled across the fields like gold dust as the state cleanup crews arrived. A convoy of white trucks and hazmat vans rolled up the winding dirt road, followed by press cars and a few marked vehicles from the Environmental Protection Bureau. Days earlier, Reed Talbot had returned in person, taller than Liam remembered from the video calls, his flannel shirt tucked into worn jeans, silver-streaked beard trimmed tight, eyes alert and weather-beaten. He shook Liam's hand without ceremony and simply said, "You did the right thing." That was all Liam needed to hear. The investigation moved swiftly once Reed's evidence matched the chemical markers of Cold War-era experimental waste. It turned out the hidden chamber beneath the stone was part of a forgotten test facility, a remote dump site for unstable compounds developed during an abandoned military project. The original contracts for the land had been brokered through shell companies, and the clause Liam had read, "preserved natural surface structures," had been a legal maneuver to prevent excavation. State officials declared the site a Level 2 containment hazard. Over the next weeks, concrete barriers were erected, contaminated soil removed in sealed tanks, and water tables filtered through portable treatment systems. The thud of machinery shook the air for days, but the most important change was silent. The sour metallic taste in the well faded, and the grass near the once dead zone grew green and full again. Coda, once coughing at the edge of the field, now sprinted through the tall grass with energy restored. His coat regained its luster, and his bark echoed across the valley with renewed strength. Liam watched from the porch, hands calloused but relaxed, the weight he had carried for so long slowly lifting. For the first time in months, maybe years, his chest didn't feel tight every morning. The local town council held a community meeting and invited Liam to speak at the press conference. He didn't wear a suit, just his old field jacket and a clean flannel shirt. Cameras clicked, microphones pointed. But when he spoke, it was quiet. "My father kept his silence to protect us. I'm speaking up to protect this land. Sometimes courage isn't about fighting a war. It's about telling the truth when it's easier not to." The crowd was still for a moment, then a long, slow round of applause rippled through the hall. As the sun dipped low behind the hills, Liam walked back to the field where it all began. The boulder that had once guarded the buried chamber now sat removed beside a marker stone, placed by the state to acknowledge the land's history. He crouched beside Coda, who lay at his feet, tail thumping gently in the evening light. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful, and this time it belonged to them. Sometimes miracles don't come in thunder or fire, but in truth brought into light, and the courage to act when it's easier to stay silent. May this story remind you that God often works through the quiet bravery of ordinary people. If this touched your heart, please like, comment, subscribe, and may the Lord bless all who watch.